we're going to get started.
Sure.
Hello, everyone. Welcome again back to the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Today, we're joined by Emmanuel. He is the Africa strategy lead of Utopia. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Joe. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So, Emmanuel, for those who are not familiar, what is Utopia?
Right. Thanks, Joe. Utopia is an urban innovation group for emerging cities. In simple terms, we sort of think of ourselves as I would say a combination of sidewalk labs and urban X. So sidewalk labs in the sense of actually going into a city and remodeling what it could look, or showing what it could look like. But urban X in the sense of supporting the entrepreneurs who are shaping the future of emerging cities, right? And we chose to focus primarily on emerging cities because, for all intents and purposes, that's where we're going to see a lot of growth over the coming decades. Data, some research show that over the next 30 years or so, 90% of urban development is going to happen across cities in Asia and Africa. So there's so much potential in emerging cities across those regions and Latin America as well, that we chose to focus on that.
So cities are obviously, because of the sheer magnitude of variables, incredibly complex, and there's different ways to view how to make cities grow and prosper. What is the specific thesis of Utopia towards making prosperous, effective, and equitable cities?
Right. So primarily, we think that entrepreneurs are going to be the ones to build our cities, right? So as much as possible, we focus a lot of our work on creating a platform for urban entrepreneurs or urban innovations to try, right? And there's so many reasons why that lens is super critical, right? But I think the primary thing, first of all, is that innovators have always been, to a large extent, one step ahead, right? And if you look at the amount of investment that needs to be made across emerging ecosystems and emerging cities, you'd realize that waiting on governments alone to provide everything would be a slow way to imagine things. I think that entrepreneurs in partnership with governments, obviously government has a huge role to play, and we sort of see our role in doing that as well. So our primary lens is this: we see entrepreneurs playing a huge role in shaping the future of emerging cities, but we think that for that to happen, there has to be an entire ecosystem of sorts. So working in partnership with governments, but also corporate stakeholders, right? Because they also have a huge role to play in that. But there's also urban professionals, urban planners, surveyors, and the likes. And then there's the research part of the work, so universities, and there's so much research on emerging cities, right? So much research on healthcare, so much research on waste management and things like that. So there's the role of universities and research centers in that. And quite frankly, there's also the role of civil society organizations. And then lastly, that's not all the component, but the last one that I want to highlight is the role of everyday citizens as well. So the question is, how do you create a platform for entrepreneurs to thrive in a way that connects all of these different stakeholders together? That's sort of how we think of our work. And to that as well, the other thing that I would add is the whole, concept of emergence in general, right? Where it's not really about like planning everything out in specific detail, but it's about recognizing patterns, right? It's about understanding what the needs of your people are. It's about understanding like what people care about and like responding to that, because cities, as we know, they're very complex, right? So you can't plan out everything in detail, but in responding to the needs of the people within the city, in responding to patterns that you see that are shaping out, I think that you have a much better shot at actually like making cities livable. So that's sort of how we see things.
Could you unpack that a little bit more? That's something that is talked about on your website a lot, the idea of emergence. There is an essential plan to cities. And a big example that is keep hammered on is the idea that quote unquote slums are actually a benefit rather than a detriment. And it sort of goes into that emergent theme. Could you expand upon that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly see this across Africa in general, where when we think of mega cities, right, or we think in terms of mega cities, and through that lens, a lot of people see slums as a bug, so to speak, in that concept, right? And what you do with bugs is to try to squash them and try to like eliminate them. But the reality is that currently across Africa, and I believe other emerging economies as well, at least 50% of people live in urban slums. 50% of people in cities actually live in slums, right? In some cases, 60% and above. So we need to first of all understand that that lens of trying to eliminate slums is probably not going to work, right? But the other thing to also look at is the fact that if you go into those slums, and informal settlements in general, you would realize that there's so much intelligence, right? There's so much, it might look chaotic on the outside, it might look like it's just a mess, so to speak, right? But when you go in there, you'd realize that there's actually a number of interesting systems that work, right? People have built their lives around like certain structures, even in that informality. And when you start to recognize the patterns in those communities, you'd realize that maybe there's actually so much that we can learn in how cities can operate, even within those communities, right? Because the whole concept of informality then leads to resilience, for instance, because you're quickly able to adapt, right? So when I think of emergence, I think of adaptability as well, right? So for us, that's important, right? So instead of trying to squash or eliminate slums in that sense, can we learn from them? Can we take that informality, so to speak, and then layer on top of that or improve on that in some ways, right? Rather than trying to eliminate informality in that complete sense of the word, but how can we learn from that and then move towards bringing them more into the formal settlements rather than trying to like clear them out and pave way for formality in that sense?
Essentially, no, I completely understand what you're saying. Informality is what makes cities grow and live. It's what builds culture and the economy. City planners cannot determine beforehand what a city will look like. It's the informal economy that will do so. And to the point of Utopia, what are examples of entrepreneurs that you all support? How are they using this concept of emergence or informality in order to not shape the city, but use its existing flow to help it grow?
Right. And I think that's an interesting question because right now we're running something called the Lagos Urban Innovation Challenge. And the whole point of the challenge is to say, hey, what's your picture of what Lagos could look like in the next coming years, and what solutions are you building to get us to that point, right? And for us, one of the key things that we ask or we look at is we don't just want niche solutions, right? We don't just want you to build, I don't know, Snapchat for kittens. I don't know if anyone has built that, but we're looking at solutions, for instance, that address key issues that people face and look at look at cities generally from the lens of the people and what exactly they need and address that in very specific terms, right? The challenge is currently running. So I guess the best answer that I can give you right now is just to wait for a few more weeks because we've seen some really interesting solutions apply for the challenge. I'm excited about. I might not be able to talk about them right now until our judges like go through the applications and then we select the top 5 or 6. But the plan with the challenge, for instance, is to then take those top 5 or 6 through what I think would be the first ever virtual urban accelerator in Africa, right? And then imagine ways that we can help them scale, right? And I can go into details of what that looks like. But I guess to your point, what we sort of gave the entrepreneurs a blank check, right? Innovators a blank check. Yes, there are specific priority themes that we're looking at, from healthcare to mobility, transportation to real estate and the built environment and the likes. But I think the beauty of approaching this from an emergent standpoint, so to speak, is just giving people the opportunity to innovate, right? And you never know what people go at.
All right, well, so the Urban Innovation Challenge, that sounds amazing. So what stage of company are you looking at? What type of check sizes are you providing towards these entrepreneurs?
Right, so they are very early stage. And by very early stage, we think of them as haven't built a minimum viable product of sorts. It's great if they're already starting to generate revenue, but that's not necessarily a criteria. But in terms of the kinds of companies that we want to select are those that we think that we have the best potential or the best opportunity to help scale. And by that, I mean providing access. For instance, a lot of times what startups need include very specifically access to government stakeholders. For instance, if you're operating within the urban context, we've seen how over time, building without a partnership with government in some ways can lead to frustration and like political risk in various different ways. So we think that access is great. Access to corporate partners. We're also guaranteeing access to a network of investors. One of the things that Utopia does very well, and one of the things that we're really good at, is we have a strong network of experts. On the one hand, people who are really strong thinkers when it comes to the urban context in general, and who have like subject matter expertise in various sectors. So we're guaranteeing access to that. But on the other hand, we're also guaranteeing access to a network of investors, right, to enable them scale. But we're also then providing resources in terms of platforms, tools, and other interesting things. But the interesting thing that I want to point out from this is that the Urban Innovation Challenge is just one thing that we're working on right now. And I think it's important to make that distinction, just because when we think of our CITYLabs, right, we think of the CITYLabs as a platform to actually create that urban ecosystem that I talked about earlier, right? And we think of the Urban Innovation Challenge as a way to activate that. Long term, well, we're actually already working on acquiring a space within Lagos that then sort of serves as a hub, right, for all of the other interesting things that we want to do. But the point that I want to make with that is we also think of the CITYLab from a venture building standpoint as a startup studio, right? Which then means that we can invest much more long-term in the solutions and in the entrepreneurs that we find interesting.
So that's an interesting point. So there's a lot of different takes on financing these new projects. Traditionally, new city projects have been government funded or large international institutions or banks, but there's this new innovation word. There's VC and there's venture studios and accelerators associated with urban innovations. Can you tell me why this is an effective strategy in helping future urban growth?
For us, it allows us a number of things. One is to be able to invest more deeply in solutions that we think need to exist, right? And by that, what I mean is, given the kind of sector that we've chosen to focus on, and given the formal versus informal lens that we spoke about earlier, sometimes we need to we need to look at the city as a whole and ask ourselves questions about what solutions need to exist, right? And sometimes maybe people aren't paying attention to that already. Maybe people aren't building that yet. And we're like, who are the entrepreneurs who are best positioned to build these solutions, and how can we help them scale? So it's not a short-term relationship, but one that's really very deep and long-term. Yes, we might try out a couple different models, we might pivot in a lot of different interesting ways, but the core thing is that we're able to then find what exactly the city needs. I mean, obviously in a very like cost-effective and sustainable manner, right? And then we try out a number of different business models. The reality of that is that that takes time, right? And while there's the accelerator lens, which we're taking with the Urban Innovation Challenge and the virtual accelerator that we've designed to support innovators in that sense, sometimes we need to look at the city as well and say, hey, we think this needs to exist, right? And how can we make it happen? And that's why we've chosen that venture builder route, which I think is very important. But to the VC question, and just accelerators in general, right? For us, we think that it's also important, broadly speaking, to be able to attract funding into that space, right? Regardless of the model. So we're going to try a lot of different interesting models. Interestingly, when we started out, we didn't even think that we were going to do a virtual accelerator, right? But in responding to the times, that's what makes the most sense. I mean, if we hadn't like put those in motion right now, maybe we would be crippled in how we're thinking about supporting entrepreneurs during COVID-19 right now. But with the virtual accelerator lens, we're able to provide valuable and tangible support right now. So that's super critical. What I'm trying to say is that it's important to try out like various different approaches, right? But the overall or the overarching goal for us is to be able to attract funding for entrepreneurs who are building cities in whatever shape or form, right? That being said, we're also very mindful that the venture capital model can also be long-term, right, from a sustainability standpoint, right? So we think of other mix of funding, right? And we think that it has to be a blended approach in how we think about funding and how we think about sustainability. And we're very mindful of that, actually.
Yes, so there are some entrepreneurs that are working to make special economic zones, which are essentially real estate projects with a different framework within the government that allows it to have different regulations, different taxation laws, sometimes even new legal systems. In places like Dubai or Shenzhen, for example, it's led to a lot of emergent growth. If there are startups that focus on that in Nigeria, would you be willing to back them through Utopia?
Right. Okay, that's definitely a very interesting question. So what I think is there are actually a number of interesting projects like that that we've seen. But the first thing that I would say is that I think, first of all, we need to look at this through that emergent lens that we spoke about. That's super critical for us. Because across Africa in general, right, there is what I would say almost an obsession for new city development, right, which may or may not be ideal. And what I mean by that is across all of Africa, we see like smart cities in quotes springing up, right? I think they are great to the extent that they are responsive to the needs of the people, right? And what I mean by that is that, and I know this is an interesting subject for you with startup societies, but my opinion about that is I think they're important, right? But they have to be done in partnership with people within cities. So I'll give you an example. We do have a concept called for micro cities, for instance. Rather than going into a new greenfield city, we would rather look at what exists. And I think that there are models where going into greenfield works, right? But the microcity concept, for instance, is about going into an existing community, an existing slum, for instance, right? And saying, how can this be transformed into a next generation city? I think that that's a much more sustainable way of thinking about it. I mean, greenfield works to the extent that that we think of it with that emergent lens as well. But to your point and to your actual question, yes, there are a number of interesting startups that we'll be looking to support. I mean, there are one or two that we are in talks with right now. But I think the critical thing for us is if it's completely greenfield and it's completely trying to design from scratch, I think we would have to think about it properly, right? Because the way we think about this is to not necessarily go build from scratch, right? Especially if it's not done in partnership with people within those communities. So if we find entrepreneurs who are doing that, then definitely we're interested.
Of course, if you do not have local stakeholders aligned and directly benefiting from the project and have their voice in the project should not happen. And I completely understand the idea.
Yeah, but the thing is, across all of Africa, we see projects where someone comes up with a really fantastic idea about the fact that there needs to be a 21st century city. There needs to be this, or like we need to create this city that in a lot of ways doesn't reflect the aspirations of the people living in those areas, for instance, right? And it goes back to my conversation earlier about how we then treat like slums as a bug within that concept to say, hey, in order to pave way for this almost glorified idea of what a mega city needs to look like, then we need to wipe out these communities, if that makes sense. And we're very mindful of that. So when we think of those special economic zones and when we think of those sort of projects, I think it's important to look, and I'm saying this specifically because this is something that's common across Africa, right? Where there are fantastic ideas of what like new city developments need to look like that don't necessarily reflect both the aspirations of the people, but are also like the realities on ground, if that makes sense.
No, that makes absolute sense. And it's important to have different theses about how urbanism can happen across the world. And it's good to have a competing view to the idea of greenfield cities and special zones, and if only to keep those projects in check and accountable to the people that they're meant to serve. So we have time for about one more question now. So I think we should have something a little bit more broader scope. What are the core handful, maybe let's say 3 or 2 principles that every person that's working in our urban innovation space should hold?
I think first of all would be that cities are made for people, right? So build for and with people, right? So we think in terms of human-centered innovations in general, right? Whatever it is that you're building needs to be built with and for people, right? Because that's what makes sense, right? Architect the city from the ground up, or from the top down rather, right? Rather think of the city as an organism of sort, or a complex system, right? With very different parts. Now, how do you approach a complex system like that? I think that one is responding to market forces, for instance, but also thinking of them, trying to observe patterns is what I would say, right? So one, to summarize, is I would say think of the people, so build with people, right? And for people, because cities are for people. And then secondly is think of cities as organisms, right? And complex systems, and treat them with adaptability rather than trying to build or construct cities top down, which is something that we've seen a lot.
Absolutely. Everyone needs to have humility when creating these things. They're living organisms, complex organisms. And I'm glad that there's organizations like yours that are approaching it as such. Well, Emmanuel, thank you so much for coming on the show. I hope you had fun. And everyone who's listening to this podcast, please follow their organization and see all the great work they're doing, especially with their upcoming challenge. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Emmanuel.
Thank you.